Carl Jung discovered that spiritual awakening doesn't inspire your hobbies, it kills them. After studying hundreds of patients who experienced consciousness shifts, Jung found that 80% abandoned their former passions within months, not because they lost talent, but because they saw through the ego games those hobbies were really serving. He identified what I call the hobby death phenomenon, the moment when your paintbrush feels foreign in your hand, when music becomes meaningless noise, when activities that once defined you suddenly feel like elaborate distractions. You thought awakening would deepen your creativity. Instead, it murdered every interest that used to make you feel alive. Right now, you might be staring at your guitar, wondering why you can't write another song, why the art supplies gather dust while you feel empty inside, why you can't force yourself to care about the hobbies that once gave your life meaning, even though you're more aware than you've ever been. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. This creative death isn't a spiritual failure, it's a psychological rebirth. And there's a specific process for understanding why your soul had to kill your hobbies before it could birth your authentic self. Before awakening, your hobbies weren't just hobbies. They were what Jung called persona builders, psychological costumes that told the world who you were supposed to be: the musician, the artist, the athlete, the gamer. Each hobby became a mask you wore to feel important, talented, or worthy. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss entirely. These hobby personas served a crucial function during your unconscious phase. They gave your ego something to cling to when you didn't know who you really were. Think about it. When someone asked, "Who are you?" you didn't say, "I'm a consciousness exploring reality." You said, "I'm a photographer," or "I'm into fitness," or "I play guitar." Your hobbies became your identity because your true self was still hidden beneath layers of conditioning. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. Patients would describe themselves through their activities, their roles, their external achievements. But awakening cracks this identification system wide open. Comment below if you used to introduce yourself by your hobbies. My hobby was my identity. This is why losing interest feels so terrifying. You're not just losing activities, you're losing the psychological foundation of who you thought you were. But Jung discovered that this identity collapse is exactly what has to happen before authentic selfhood can emerge. The persona was never you. It was just the costume you wore while you figured out who you actually are. Here's where Jung's insight becomes profound, and this explains why you can't force yourself to care anymore. Before awakening, your hobbies were powered by what Jung called ego motivation, the need to achieve, to be seen, to feel special, to escape discomfort. You painted because the finished piece made you feel talented. You made music because performing gave you validation. You exercised because the results boosted your confidence. Every hobby was secretly serving your ego's hunger for significance. But awakening disrupts this entire motivational system. When consciousness expands, the ego's desperate need for external validation begins to dissolve. Therefore, the fuel that powered your hobbies evaporates overnight. Jung called this motivational reorientation, the psyche's shift from external rewards to internal authenticity. What I call the ego to soul transition. Your consciousness has outgrown the need to prove itself through hobbies. This is why you might feel confused when people ask, "Why don't you paint anymore?" You can't explain that painting used to feed something in you that no longer needs feeding. The part of you that craved recognition, achievement, or escape has been psychologically dismantled. But here's what Jung discovered through decades of analysis. This motivational death isn't permanent. It's preparatory. Your psyche is clearing out ego-driven motivations to make space for soul-driven inspirations. The old motivation had to die because it was built on psychological dependency. What emerges next will be built on psychological freedom. Comment if your old hobbies now feel like performance rather than passion. I can't pretend to care anymore. Jung understood that this transition period feels like spiritual emptiness, but it's actually spiritual preparation. Your soul is learning to create from authenticity rather than anxiety. But Jung discovered something even darker about why hobbies lose their appeal after awakening. Many of your former passions weren't just ego builders. They were what Jung called shadow managers, unconscious strategies to avoid feeling emotions you weren't ready to face. This is what I call the hobby as escape revelation. Jung documented that many patients used creative activities, sports, gaming, or collecting as sophisticated avoidance mechanisms. On the surface, these looked like healthy interests. Underneath, they were psychological pain relievers. Maybe you painted to escape loneliness. Maybe you played music to drown out anxiety. Maybe you exercised to avoid feeling powerless. Maybe you gamed to escape the overwhelming complexity of real relationships. Jung's concept of the shadow, those hidden wounds, fears, and emotions we bury because they threaten our self-image, explains why awakening kills these hobby escapes. When consciousness expands, the shadow stops hiding. Therefore, the activities you use to manage shadow emotions lose their numbing power. Suddenly, you sit down to paint, and instead of entering creative flow, you feel the loneliness you were avoiding. You pick up your guitar, and instead of losing yourself in music, you encounter the grief you've been running from. Jung called this shadow confrontation, the moment when awakening forces you to meet the emotions your hobbies were helping you escape. It's terrifying because for the first time, you can't distract yourself from your own psychological reality. This is why the hobby death feels so brutal. You're not just losing activities, you're losing your primary coping mechanisms. The things that helped you avoid your inner world suddenly stop working. Comment if your hobbies used to help you escape difficult emotions. My creativity was my hiding place. But Jung understood that this shadow confrontation, while painful, is psychologically necessary. You can't become whole while running from half of yourself. The hobbies had to stop working so you could finally face what you've been avoiding. Jung discovered that on the other side of shadow integration lies authentic creativity, art that emerges from wholeness rather than hiddenness. Jung recognized that losing your hobbies after awakening is part of what mystics call the dark night of the soul, but he gave it a psychological framework, what I call the meaning collapse phase. This isn't just about hobbies dying, it's about the entire value system that supported those hobbies crumbling. The goals that once excited you, winning competitions, finishing projects, getting recognition, suddenly feel meaningless because your consciousness has shifted to a different level of reality. Jung documented this pattern across cultures and centuries. When individuals undergo genuine spiritual transformation, they inevitably pass through a period where their previous sources of meaning become psychologically irrelevant. Before awakening, you operated from what Jung called collective values, the shared agreements about what matters, what's worth pursuing, what brings fulfillment. Society told you that creative achievement, physical accomplishments, or skill mastery were inherently meaningful. But awakening reveals these values as arbitrary constructions. Therefore, hobbies built on these foundations lose their psychological gravity. You can't force yourself to care about things that feel fundamentally hollow. Jung called this the collision with meaninglessness, the stage where previously important activities feel empty because they were based on unexamined assumptions about what life is supposed to be about. This is why you might lie in bed staring at your art supplies, feeling like nothing matters. Your consciousness has expanded beyond the meaning system that supported those activities. But the new meaning system hasn't crystallized yet. Jung compared this to psychological winter, a necessary dormancy period where the old growth dies back so new growth can emerge. The hobbies belong to the old meaning system. They have to decompose before authentic passions can sprout. Comment if everything that used to matter now feels pointless. I'm lost between who I was and who I'm becoming. Jung discovered that this meaninglessness isn't permanent emptiness, it's pregnant emptiness. Something new is gestating in the void where your old interests used to live. Here's where Jung's understanding becomes transformative. He discovered that the death of ego-driven hobbies creates space for what he called authentic self-expression, activities that emerge from your true nature rather than your psychological needs. Jung distinguished between persona activities and self-activities. Persona activities serve the mask you wear for the world. Self-activities serve the deeper truth of who you are. Before awakening, most hobbies were persona activities disguised as authentic interests. But when the persona dissolves during awakening, space opens for genuine self-expression. What I call soul-sourced creativity. Instead of creating to prove something, you create to express something. Instead of doing to achieve, you do to be. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. Your hobbies had to die because they belong to the should-be version of yourself. What emerges next will belong to the actually are version. This is why you can't force your old interests back to life. You're trying to resurrect activities that belong to a psychological identity that no longer exists. It's like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit, not because you've grown physically, but because you've grown psychologically. Jung documented that authentic self-expression often looks completely different from persona-driven hobbies. Maybe you were a competitive athlete, but now you're drawn to gentle walking in nature. Maybe you were a performance-focused musician, but now you're called to silent meditation. These new activities aren't hobbies in the old sense. They're not about achieving or becoming. They're about being and expressing. Jung called them self-realizing activities, ways your authentic nature moves through you into the world. Comment if you're sensing new interests that feel completely different. Something new wants to be born through me. But Jung warned that this emergence can't be rushed. The authentic self reveals itself in its own timing. Your job isn't to force new passions into existence. It's to remain open to what wants to emerge naturally. Jung developed specific insights about how to navigate this transition from dead hobbies to authentic expression, what I call the hobby-death integration process. First, Jung emphasized grieving the persona. You need to acknowledge that something real has died, not just activities, but the version of yourself that needed those activities to feel complete. This grief is sacred because it honors the psychological transformation you're undergoing. Don't try to convince yourself you'll get interested again. Don't force yourself back into old patterns. Jung understood that authentic transformation requires letting go completely before anything new can emerge. Second, Jung recommended shadow befriending. Instead of avoiding the emotions your hobbies use to manage, start developing a conscious relationship with them. If you painted to escape loneliness, learn to sit with loneliness directly. If you game to avoid anxiety, practice being present with anxiety. Jung discovered that when you stop running from shadow emotions through hobby distractions, those same emotions transform into creative energy. The loneliness becomes depth. The anxiety becomes sensitivity. The grief becomes compassion. Third, Jung suggested authentic experimentation. Try activities you've never considered before, not to become good at them, but to discover what resonates with your emerging self. Maybe writing, gardening, cooking, walking, or simply sitting in silence. Jung called this active imagination, allowing your authentic self to explore new forms of expression without the pressure of mastery or achievement. The goal isn't to find new hobbies, it's to discover new ways your true nature wants to move through the world. Comment if you're experimenting with completely new forms of expression. I'm discovering who I am through what I'm drawn to. Jung understood that this integration phase requires patience and trust. Your authentic interests will emerge when your psyche is ready to support them. Forcing leads to more persona building. Allowing leads to genuine self-discovery. Jung made a crucial distinction about life phases that explains why hobby death often intensifies after major awakenings. He argued that the first half of life is devoted to what he called ego building, establishing career, social status, and adapting to collective expectations. But the second half of life requires a fundamental reorientation toward inner meaning. Jung called this the afternoon of life, and he observed that people who don't make this transition often experience what feels like existential crisis. Your hobbies dying might be a sign that you're being called into this deeper phase of psychological development. During the morning of life, hobbies serve ego development. They help you build skills, confidence, social connections, and identity. But during the afternoon of life, activities must serve soul development. They become vehicles for self-discovery, meaning-making, and authentic expression. This is why forcing your old hobbies back to life feels so futile. You're trying to use afternoon of life consciousness to engage in morning of life activities. The mismatch creates that hollow, forced feeling that makes nothing seem worthwhile. Jung discovered that people who successfully navigate this transition often find themselves drawn to completely different forms of engagement. Instead of competitive sports, they might be called to nature walking. Instead of social networking, they might prefer solitary reflection. Instead of accumulating skills, they might focus on wisdom cultivation. For older people who feel their lives have lost purpose after awakening, Jung would suggest that rediscovering or developing new interests aligned with this deeper phase of life is crucial. But these new interests won't look like traditional hobbies. They'll look like spiritual practices, creative expressions, service activities, or contemplative pursuits. Jung understood that this afternoon of life transition is often triggered by what appear to be crises, death of loved ones, career changes, health challenges, or spiritual awakenings. What feels like breakdown is actually breakthrough into a more meaningful phase of existence. The key insight Jung offered is that you're not losing your capacity for joy and engagement. You're outgrowing the forms of joy and engagement that belong to an earlier phase of psychological development. What wants to emerge is age-appropriate, consciousness-appropriate engagement with life. This is why the hobby death phenomenon, while disorienting, is actually evidence of healthy psychological development. Your psyche is calling you deeper, asking you to engage with life from a more mature, integrated, authentic place. The hobby death integration process. First, Jung emphasized grieving the persona. You need to acknowledge that something real has died, not just activities, but the version of yourself that needed those activities to feel complete. This grief is sacred because it honors the psychological transformation you're undergoing. Don't try to convince yourself you'll get interested again. Don't force yourself back into old patterns. Jung understood that authentic transformation requires letting go completely before anything new can emerge. Second, Jung recommended shadow befriending. Instead of avoiding the emotions your hobbies used to manage, start developing a conscious relationship with them. If you painted to escape loneliness, learn to sit with loneliness directly. If you gamed to avoid anxiety, practice being present with anxiety. Jung discovered that when you stop running from shadow emotions through hobby distractions, those same emotions transform into creative energy. The loneliness becomes depth, the anxiety becomes sensitivity, the grief becomes compassion. Third, Jung suggested authentic experimentation. Try activities you've never considered before, not to become good at them, but to discover what resonates with your emerging self. Maybe writing, gardening, cooking, walking, or simply sitting in silence. Jung called this active imagination, allowing your authentic self to explore new forms of expression without the pressure of mastery or achievement. The goal isn't to find new hobbies, It's to discover new ways your true nature wants to move through the world. Comment if you're experimenting with completely new forms of expression. I'm discovering who I am through what I'm drawn to. Jung understood that this integration phase requires patience and trust. Your authentic interests will emerge when your psyche is ready to support them. Forcing leads to more persona building. Allowing leads to genuine self-discovery. Jung's most profound insight was that the death of old hobbies isn't an ending. It's what he called psychological rebirth. The person who emerges from this process isn't a broken version of who you were. They're a more authentic version of who you've always been underneath the conditioning. Your old hobbies served their purpose during your unconscious phase. They gave you identity, achievement, escape, and connection when you didn't know how to access these things directly. But awakening means you no longer need external activities to feel whole. Jung called this integrated creativity, the ability to create, play, and engage not from psychological neediness, but from psychological fullness. When activities return to your life, they serve expression rather than compensation. Maybe painting comes back, but now it's meditation rather than validation seeking. Maybe music returns, but now it's soul expression rather than ego performance. Maybe physical activity resurges, but now it's body celebration rather than body fixing. Jung discovered that individuals who complete this hobby death transition become far more creative than they ever were before, but their creativity serves life rather than image, authenticity rather than achievement, love rather than lack. This is why Jung considered the hobby death phenomenon a gift rather than a loss. It forces you to discover the difference between doing to prove yourself and doing to express yourself. That difference changes everything. Comment if you're starting to sense authentic creativity emerging. I'm creating from wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung spent decades documenting this pattern because he recognized it as one of the most reliable signs of genuine psychological maturation. When someone stops needing external activities to feel worthy, they become capable of authentic contribution to the world. So there you have it, Jung's complete framework for understanding why your hobbies died after awakening and what that death actually means. Remember what I said at the beginning. Jung discovered that spiritual awakening doesn't inspire your hobbies, it kills them. But now you understand why. Those hobbies belong to the ego-driven, shadow-avoiding, persona-building version of yourself that awakening necessarily dissolves. You're not broken because you can't force yourself to care about painting anymore. You're not lazy because your guitar sits untouched. You're not depressed because your old passions feel dead. You're psychologically evolving. Jung understood that this hobby death is actually psychological birth, the emergence of an authentic self that doesn't need external activities to feel complete. What feels like creative death is actually creative preparation. Your soul had to kill your ego-driven hobbies before it could birth soul-driven expressions. The emptiness you're feeling isn't permanent void, it's fertile ground. Something new is growing in the space where your old interests used to live. Jung spent his life studying this transformation because he recognized it as one of the most important psychological developments a human being can undergo. You're not losing your creativity, you're graduating to authentic creativity. The question isn't how to get your old hobbies back. The question is, what wants to be born through you now that you no longer need external validation to feel whole? Comment below. I trust the death before the birth if you're ready to embrace this transformation process. Jung would tell you to be patient with the emptiness, honor the death, trust the process. Something authentic is trying to emerge through you, but only after you've fully released what no longer serves your awakened consciousness. If you want to explore more of Jung's insights about rare consciousness patterns, check out my video, 8 Signs You Have a Mind. 99% of people can't. understand where we explore how awakened minds process reality in ways most people can't comprehend. And if this video helped you understand why your hobbies feel dead, share it with someone else who might be struggling with the same confusion. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is help another person realize they're not broken, they're breaking through. Your authentic self is worth the death of every fake interest you ever cultivated. Jung understood this, and now, hopefully, so do you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.